The stars drifted by like tiny lanterns in the cold, endless void of space. Jake Monroe sat in the cockpit of his cargo ship, humming softly to himself. It had been a long haul, and he was ready to get home. His ship, the Rust Bucket, wasn't fancy, but it got the job done. Jake was about to set a course for the nearest station when a faint beeping sound filled the cabin. He glanced at the screen. A distress signal. Weak. Almost. Too faint to notice. "Great," Jake muttered. He leaned back in his seat, rubbing his chin. Distress signals in this part of space were rare and dangerous. Pirates sometimes used them to lure ships. But what if it wasn't a trap? He sighed, tapping the screen to trace the signal. "Guess I'm not sleeping tonight." As the Rust Bucket followed the signal, a large, damaged transport ship came into view. Its outer hull was cracked, and faint sparks flickered in the darkness. No running lights. No signs of life. Jake circled the ship carefully. "Hello. This is Jake Monroe of the Rust Bucket. Do you need assistance?" His voice echoed in the silence. No response. His hand hovered over the controls. He could leave. No one would know. But as he stared at the ship, something gnawed at him. "Damn it," he muttered, docking his ship alongside the transport. The airlock hissed open, and Jake stepped inside. His boots clanked against the metal floor. The ship was cold. Too cold. Emergency lights flickered along the hallway, casting long shadows. Jake pressed forward, his hand resting on his sidearm. The silence felt heavy, like the ship itself was holding its breath. As he moved deeper inside, he found shattered glass and broken equipment. "What happened here?" he whispered. Near the control room, Jake stopped. A large door was partially open. Inside, 4 cryopods glowed faintly in the darkness. Jake stepped closer. The pods held 4 young alien girls. They were humanoid but had faintly glowing blue skin and delicate markings on their foreheads. Their clothes were torn, and their faces looked peaceful, but pale. A screen flickered beside the pods, flashing red. Life support failing. Jake's heart pounded. They didn't have much time. He pressed a button, activating the pod release sequence. One by one, the pods hissed open, releasing cold mist into the air. The girls slowly stirred, their eyes fluttering open. The first girl sat up, blinking at him with large, glowing eyes. She looked at him for a long moment, then whispered, "You shouldn't have done that." Jake raised an eyebrow. "You're welcome," he said dryly, helping her out of the pod. The other 3 followed, their legs shaky as they stepped forward. "Who are you?" Jake asked. The girl hesitated. We were running. They found us." Jake frowned. "Who found you?" Before she could answer, an alarm blared across the transport. Jake's communicator crackled to life. "Unknown vessel detected. Incoming ships." Jake cursed under his breath. "We've got company." He guided the girls quickly back to the Rust Bucket. As soon as the airlock sealed, Jake rushed to the cockpit. 3 ships were approaching fast. "Strap in," Jake shouted. The girls stumbled into the co-pilot's seat, holding onto each other. Jake gripped the controls, pushing the thrusters to maximum. The Rust Bucket jolted forward, narrowly avoiding laser fire from the pursuing ships. "Who the hell did I just rescue?" Jake muttered as he weaved through an asteroid field, dodging more blasts. One of the girls placed her hand on his arm. Her eyes glowed softly. "We cannot go back. They will destroy us." Jake met her gaze, his stomach tightening. "Well, they're going to have to catch me first." The chase continued for several minutes, but Jake's quick flying outmaneuvered the enemy. As the hostile ships faded from the radar, Jake finally relaxed, exhaling deeply. He turned to the girls. "All right, you're safe, for now. But I need answers." The first girl hesitated. "We will tell you. But please, do not leave us." Jake glanced at them. He hadn't planned on becoming a babysitter today, but something in their eyes told him this wasn't over. "Fine," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You're stuck with me for now. Let's see where this takes us." As the stars stretched ahead, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that his simple life had just gotten a lot more complicated. Jake Monroe had been in trouble before, but this felt different. The 4 alien girls sat quietly in the corner of his ship, their eyes reflecting the soft blue lights of the cockpit. They hadn't spoken much since he rescued them, but Jake could feel the weight of their presence. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It felt more like something was watching them. "All right," Jake said, leaning against the console. "You're on my ship. You're safe for now. But you need to start talking. Who's after you?" The oldest-looking girl, the one with faint silver markings on her skin, met his gaze. Her glowing blue eyes seemed to pierce through him. "They will not stop," she said softly. "They know we are here." Jake frowned. Not exactly the comforting answer I was hoping for. Before she could say more, his ship's sensors blared to life. 3 signals appeared on the radar, approaching fast. Jake's heart sank. "Great. We've got company." He pushed the thrusters, sending the rust bucket hurtling through space, but the ships on his tail were fast, too fast. The communicator crackled. A deep, gravelly voice filled the cabin. "Cargo ship Rust Bucket. Surrender the fugitives, and we'll let you live." Jake glanced at the girls. They stared at the floor, silent and tense. He hit the reply button. "You've got the wrong guy. I don't know what fugitives you're talking about. Don't play games. We tracked their pods to your ship. Hand them over. Pilot." Jake's hands tightened on the controls. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a soldier. But something about the way these girls sat there, so quiet and resigned, made his blood boil. "No deal," Jake said, cutting the transmission. "Hold on." He yanked the controls to the side, sending the ship spinning between asteroid fragments. The pursuing ships opened fire, but Jake twisted and ducked, dodging their blasts by inches. One of the girls suddenly stood and touched the wall of the ship. Her eyes glowed brighter, and the flickering power stabilizers hummed as if the ship itself responded to her. Jake stared. "What are you doing?" "I am helping," she said simply. The rust bucket surged forward, faster than it had any right to go. Jake grinned. "Okay, that's new." The enemy ships tried to keep up, but the distance grew between them. Finally, the radar cleared, and the silence returned. Jake leaned back, breathing hard. "All right. Now can someone explain why bounty hunters are chasing you?" The oldest girl hesitated, glancing at the others. Finally, she spoke. "We are not supposed to be alive," she said quietly. "We were marked for death." Jake raised an eyebrow. "You're not making this easier for me, you know." She sighed. "We are from a place far from here. Our world fell. The ones who took it did not want survivors. We escaped, but only barely." Jake ran a hand through his hair. "And now they're chasing you across the galaxy." The girl nodded. "They will not stop. They will hunt us until we are gone." Jake studied her face. She wasn't lying. But what caught his attention more than her words was the look in her eyes, a strange mix of exhaustion and quiet defiance. "Why didn't they finish the job when they had the chance?" Jake asked. One of the younger girls spoke this time, her voice soft and uncertain. "They fear what we can become." Jake narrowed his eyes. "And what's that?" No one answered. Instead, the oldest girl stepped forward, placing a hand lightly on Jake's arm. "You saved us," she said. "That means they will hunt you too now." Jake snorted. "Yeah, I kinda figured that part out already." Her hand tightened just slightly. "Thank you." Jake shifted uncomfortably, shrugging off the sudden wave of emotion that followed. "Don't mention it. Seriously, let's just focus on not getting blown up for now." The girl smiled faintly, the first sign of warmth he'd seen from her. As Jake set the course for the next space station, he couldn't help but feel like he'd just stepped into something far bigger than himself. And somehow, he knew, The bounty hunters weren't going to be the worst of it. Jake Monroe woke up to the sound of soft humming. For a moment, he thought he was still dreaming. The soft melody drifted through the narrow halls of the rust bucket, wrapping around the silence like a warm blanket. It wasn't mechanical or part of the ship. It was different. When Jake sat up, he saw her. One of the alien girls stood at the far end of the cabin, gazing out of the window at the stars. Her silver markings glowed faintly, almost like fireflies dancing on her skin. She wasn't humming with her mouth. It seemed to come from her, like the sound itself was part of her being. Jake rubbed his eyes. Could you, not do the creepy glowing thing in the middle of the night? The girl turned to him, her glowing eyes soft and calm. I apologize. I did not mean to disturb you. Jake stretched, yawning. Well, you did. What are you doing up anyway? She hesitated, looking back at the stars. We listen when the stars call. Jake raised an eyebrow. Right. Of course you do. Before he could question her further, the lights in the cabin flickered. Jake frowned and checked the monitor. Strange. Power flow is all over the place, he muttered. I just fixed that last week. Suddenly, the cabin lights stabilized. The girl was now resting her hand lightly on the console. Her markings glowed a little brighter, and the screen read power stabilized. Jake blinked. Wait a second. Did you just fix that? With your hand? The girl met his eyes but said nothing. Jake crossed his arms. I'm starting to feel like you four are a little more than just lost alien princesses running from trouble. At that moment, the youngest of the girls appeared from the lower deck, rubbing her eyes. She shuffled up next to the older girl, leaning into her side like a younger sibling. Is something wrong? The smaller one asked sleepily. Jake exhaled, shaking his head. Yeah, just my sanity. He turned back to the cockpit, eyeing the radar. No signs of pursuit. For now. As the hours passed, Jake worked in silence, occasionally glancing back at the girls. They sat quietly, speaking softly in their own language. It wasn't like anything Jake had ever heard. Melodic, smooth, but with undertones that almost felt ancient. Then it happened. Jake was in the engine room, tightening loose cables, when the wrench slipped. A sharp gash tore across his palm. Ah, damn it, he hissed, cradling his bleeding hand. Before he could grab the med kit, one of the girls appeared beside him. She knelt, gently taking his hand in hers. Hey, it's fine. I've had worse, Jake muttered. But the girl ignored him. Her fingertips hovered just above the wound, and a soft blue light pulsed between them. Within seconds, the gash closed as if it had never been there. Jake stared at his palm in disbelief. Okay, now that's definitely not normal. The girl smiled faintly but said nothing. You're going to tell me what's going on eventually, Jake said, narrowing his eyes. I don't like being kept in the dark. The older girl, who had been watching from the doorway, spoke softly. It is not that we wish to hide things from you, but knowing the truth may put you in more danger. Jake wiped his hand on his pants. Lady, I think I crossed the danger line about 2 days ago when I picked you up. So let's hear it. The girl stepped forward, standing just a few feet from him, her glowing eyes locked onto his. We are not ordinary, she said, her voice calm but firm. We are the last of something ancient, a people who were different from the rest of the galaxy. Those who hunt us fear that if we survive, we will rise again. Jake narrowed his eyes. Rised? You mean like warriors? She shook her head. No, we are not warriors, but we carry the gifts of those who came before us. Gifts that can heal or destroy. Jake let that sink in. He wasn't sure how to respond. He had heard plenty of wild stories traveling the stars, but this felt different. All right, Jake finally said, sighing. So, you're ancient space royalty with magical powers. Got it. But that still doesn't explain why you won't leave. The girl's gaze softened. Because we trust you. You did not have to save us, but you did. Few in this galaxy would have risked their lives for strangers. Jake scratched the back of his neck, feeling a bit awkward. Yeah, well, I'm not exactly the smartest guy sometimes. The youngest girl giggled softly, and for the first time, the cabin felt a little less heavy. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The people chasing them weren't going to stop. And now, they knew Jake was protecting them. As he stared out into the void of space, he muttered under his breath, "What the hell did I get myself into?" Jake Monroe wasn't used to company. For years, his ship, the Rust Bucket, had been his only companion. Long hauls across empty space meant days of silence, broken only by the hum of the engines. But now, that silence was gone. The 4 alien girls he'd rescued filled the small ship with life and chaos. At first, Jake thought they'd keep to themselves, but he was wrong. Very wrong. "Stop touching that," Jake barked, rushing over as the youngest girl poked curiously at the wiring under his control panel. She blinked up at him innocently, her bright blue eyes wide. It was broken. Jake crossed his arms. It wasn't broken. It was barely hanging on. There's a difference. Before he could scold her further, the panel flickered to life, running smoother than it had in years. Jake's jaw tightened. "All right. Thanks, I guess." The girl smiled proudly and skipped back to the others. The 4 girls had settled into the crew quarters, but they rarely stayed there. They wandered the ship, exploring every inch like curious children. Jake was beginning to feel like a babysitter rather than a pilot. Late one evening, Jake found the oldest of the girls sitting in the cargo bay, staring out at the stars through the viewing window. Her silver markings shimmered faintly under the dim lights. "You all right?" Jake asked, leaning against the doorway. She didn't turn. "I am. Thinking." "Thinking about what?" She was silent for a moment, then finally said, "Home." Jake nodded slowly. "I get that. Been a long time since I've been home too." She glanced at him, her glowing eyes soft. "You left your world behind." Jake sighed, walking over to sit beside her. "Didn't leave it. Just drifted away." The stars felt quieter. Easier to live out here sometimes. The girl tilted her head slightly, as if studying him. "And yet you saved us. Why?" Jake looked at her, then shrugged. "Guess I'm not as heartless as I thought." She smiled faintly but said nothing. For the next few days, the ship felt different. The girls started helping more, fixing small things Jake hadn't even noticed were broken. They seemed to understand the Rust Bucket in a way Jake didn't. One morning, Jake woke up to find his ship's engines humming softly, more efficiently than ever before. The girls were in the engine room, their hands glowing faintly as they worked together in silence. Jake watched from the doorway, arms crossed. You know, most people would charge a fortune for ship repairs. The youngest girl grinned. "We like your ship. It feels kind." Jake blinked. "Kind? It's a ship, not a puppy." The oldest girl stepped forward, brushing her fingers along the engine's surface. "Some things are more than they seem." Jake wasn't sure how to respond to that. Later that day, while eating, Jake finally asked the question that had been bothering him. "Why won't you leave?" The table went quiet. The girls exchanged glances, as if deciding who should speak. Finally, the oldest one said, "We are safer with you." Jake raised an eyebrow. "I'm just a cargo pilot, not a soldier." She smiled softly. "And yet, you fought for us." Jake opened his mouth to argue but stopped. She wasn't wrong. He had fought, harder than he'd expected. "Yeah, well, I wasn't about to let bounty hunters snatch you away," Jake muttered. The youngest girl piped up. "That is why we stay. You fight for things that others would not." Jake leaned back in his chair, rubbing the back of his neck. "You're really trying to make this harder for me, aren't you?" The girl smiled but said nothing. As the ship drifted quietly through space, Jake felt something strange. He had always been alone, and preferred it that way. But now, The ship felt less empty. Late one night, as Jake worked in the cockpit, he heard soft footsteps behind him. One of the girls stood at the doorway, clutching a blanket. "Can't sleep?" Jake asked without turning around. She hesitated, then nodded. "The stars are loud tonight." Jake raised an eyebrow. "I don't hear anything." She smiled faintly. "You wouldn't." Jake gestured to the co-pilot's seat. "Sit down. You can keep me company for a bit." She climbed into the seat, curling up quietly. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "You know, if you're going to stick around, I might have to start charging rent." The girl giggled softly. "We have nothing to pay." Jake smirked. "Figures." As the ship sailed through the quiet void, Jake realized something he hadn't in years. He didn't mind the company. Not at all. Jake Monroe wasn't ready for the truth. He had known from the start that the 4 alien girls weren't ordinary. The glowing eyes, strange abilities, and the way they seemed to fix his ship with just a touch made that clear. But Jake wasn't the kind of guy to dig too deep. He preferred simple answers, until now. It was supposed to be a quiet night. Jake was in the cockpit, staring at the stars while sipping lukewarm coffee. The girls were in the lower deck, whispering in their own language. They'd been talking more lately, like they were planning something. Jake didn't like that. He wasn't afraid of them, not exactly. But there was a part of him that knew whatever secret they were hiding could blow up in his face. Before he could finish his thoughts, the oldest girl stepped into the cockpit. Her silver markings shimmered faintly under the cabin lights. "We need to talk," she said softly. Jake glanced at her. That's never a good start. She stepped closer, folding her hands in front of her. "It's time you know why they are hunting us." Jake set his coffee down. "I was wondering when we'd get to that part." The girl looked at the stars through the window, her eyes distant. "Our world is gone," she began. "It was taken by force. The ones who came left nothing behind." Jake frowned. "Pirates? Invaders?" "No," she shook her head. "They were once like us, but they changed. They became something darker. When they rose to power, they feared what we might become." Jake leaned forward. "Become? What does that mean?" She hesitated, her glowing eyes meeting his. "We are the last of our kind. The last bloodline of the ones who could shape the stars." Jake blinked. "Shape the stars? I'm gonna need a simpler explanation." The girl stepped closer, resting her hand lightly on the console. The lights flickered softly, responding to her touch. "We are what remains of the old rulers," she said quietly. "Not rulers by force, but by nature. The galaxy was once balanced because of our ancestors' gifts, but when our enemies rose, they destroyed that balance. And us." Jake exhaled slowly, rubbing his face. "So, you're saying you're royalty? Space queens or something?" She smiled faintly. "Something like that. But our power is not in titles. It is in what we carry." Jake's eyes narrowed. "And what exactly do you carry?" The girl placed her hand over her chest. "The last pieces of what our people were. We are not fully awake. Not yet. But in time, we could rebuild what was lost." Jake leaned back in his seat, letting that sink in. "So that's why they're after you. They want to make sure you never wake up." She nodded solemnly. For a long moment, the cabin was silent except for the hum of the ship. Jake finally broke the silence with a heavy sigh. "You know, I thought I was just picking up stranded passengers. Now I find out I'm babysitting space goddesses." The girl chuckled softly. "We are far from goddesses." "Tell that to the bounty hunters," Jake muttered. He glanced at her, noticing the way she held herself, calm, but with an edge of sadness she tried to hide. "So, what happens now?" Jake asked. The girl's expression grew serious. "Now, we prepare. They will not stop hunting us. And by saving us, you have made yourself their enemy." Jake smirked, crossing his arms. "I figured that part out a while ago." At that moment, the radar flashed red. Jake's eyes snapped to the screen. 3 ships approaching fast. "Speak of the devil," he muttered. The girl's eyes glowed brighter as she gazed at the approaching ships. "They found us." Jake tightened his grip on the controls. "Yeah, I noticed. Strap in. This is about to get messy." Before he could start evasive maneuvers, the girl placed her hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to fight them." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Got a better idea?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Let me handle this." Jake watched as she moved toward the center of the cabin. Her markings shimmered brighter, casting soft blue light across the room. The ships outside slowed, their weapons powering up. Jake's hand hovered over the thrusters, ready to run. But then something happened. The girl closed her eyes, and a faint pulse rippled from her body. The enemy ships flickered on the radar, then powered down, drifting silently in space. Jake's mouth fell open. "Did you just shut down their ships?" She turned to him, her eyes glowing softly. "They will sleep for a while, but not forever." Jake stared at her, a strange mix of awe and disbelief flooding his mind. "All right," he said slowly. "Maybe you are goddesses." She smiled faintly. "We are just trying to survive, Jake." As the enemy ships drifted lifelessly in space, Jake realized one thing. The galaxy was a lot bigger and stranger than he'd ever imagined. Jake Monroe stared at the radar, his knuckles white against the controls. The enemy ships, once dormant, were back. And this time, they weren't slowing down. 3 ships, Jake muttered. "Armed to the teeth. That's overkill, don't you think?" The oldest alien girl, the one he now thought of as their leader, stood behind him, calm as ever. Her glowing eyes reflected the flashing red lights in the cockpit. "They know we are here," she said quietly, "and they fear what we might become." Jake smirked, though his heart pounded. "Yeah, well, I'd rather not become space dust today." The radar flashed again. The enemy ships were closing fast, spreading out to cut off any escape routes. "Looks like running's not an option." Jake's voice was steady, but his mind raced. One of the younger girls stepped into the cockpit, clutching the edge of his seat nervously. "We can help," she said softly. Jake glanced at her. "I appreciate that, kid, but this isn't a magic trick. They've got weapons, a lot of them." She hesitated, then placed her hand on the console. The metal under her palm shimmered faintly, and for a moment, Jake felt the entire ship hum beneath his feet. "Maybe," she whispered, "but so do we." Jake's eyes widened as the rust bucket systems lit up, stronger than ever before. Shields pulsed, thrusters surged, and the targeting sensors sharpened with a clarity Jake had never seen. "What did you just do?" Jake asked, trying not to sound too impressed. The girl smiled faintly. "We woke it up." Before Jake could respond, the comm system crackled to life. A cold, sharp voice filled the cabin. "You have something that doesn't belong to you. Surrender the girls, and you can leave unharmed." Jake leaned toward the mic. "Oh, is that all?" "Sure. Let me just." He killed the transmission mid-sentence. "Yeah, not happening." The oldest girl placed her hand on his shoulder. "Thank you." Jake shrugged. "I didn't say I was doing it for free." The enemy ships opened fire. Bright red bolts of energy streaked toward the rust bucket. Jake pulled the controls hard, banking the ship just in time to avoid the first barrage. The girls held on tight as the ship twisted and spun, returning fire with pulse cannons that Jake didn't even know he had. "All right, I officially like this upgrade," Jake shouted as one of the enemy ships veered off, trailing smoke. The cockpit shook violently as another blast grazed their side. Sparks flew from the panels. Jake gritted his teeth, yanking hard on the controls to keep them steady. "We can't take too many hits like that," he muttered. The oldest girl stepped forward, her eyes glowing brighter. "Let me try." Before Jake could argue, she placed both hands on the console. The lights in the cabin dimmed as energy rippled outward from her body. Outside, the second enemy ship began to slow, its systems flickering uncontrollably. Within seconds, it drifted aimlessly, powerless. Jake stared in disbelief. "You shut them down again." The girl nodded but swayed slightly, gripping the edge of the console to steady herself. "You all right?" Jake asked, concern flickering in his eyes. She nodded, though her breathing was heavier. "It takes energy. But I can still stand." The last ship, clearly aware of what had happened to the others, didn't wait. It charged forward, weapons firing rapidly. Jake cursed under his breath. They're not playing around anymore. The smallest girl suddenly tugged at his sleeve. "I can shield us. Just for a moment." Jake glanced at her, unsure. "You sure about that?" She nodded, determination burning in her glowing eyes. "All right, kid. Do your thing." The girl placed both hands on the floor, and a faint blue barrier flickered around the ship just as the enemy's barrage struck. Energy bolts scattered harmlessly across the shield, leaving Jake stunned. "You've really been holding out on me, haven't you?" he said, grinning. The girl smiled weakly but held the barrier. Jake seized the opportunity, steering the rust bucket toward the remaining enemy ship. He didn't have firepower like them, but he had something better: desperation. "Hold on tight," Jake roared, spinning the ship to face the enemy directly. With the ship's enhanced speed, he shot forward, weaving between blasts until they were practically on top of the enemy vessel. At the last second, Jake pulled hard to the side, narrowly avoiding a collision as the girls unleashed a pulse of energy directly into the enemy ship's hull. The final ship flickered, lights dimming as its engines sputtered out. It drifted silently alongside the others. Jake exhaled heavily, leaning back in his chair. That was something. The girls stood quietly behind him, their eyes still glowing faintly. The ship hummed softly, like it had just exhaled along with Jake. "You saved us again," the oldest girl said gently. Jake grinned. "Yeah, well, I didn't exactly have a choice, did I?" The girls exchanged soft smiles, and for the first time, Jake felt like maybe, just maybe, they had a shot at surviving whatever came next. As they drifted silently through the void, Jake muttered under his breath, "I really need to start charging for this." The battlefield drifted behind them, a graveyard of silent ships floating in the dark. Jake Monroe leaned back in his seat, running a hand through his hair. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving only exhaustion in its place. The four alien girls sat quietly in the cockpit, their glowing eyes dim but calm. "Well," Jake said, breaking the silence, "I don't know about you, but I'd call that a win." The youngest girl smiled faintly. "You were brave." Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "I was reckless. There's a difference." The oldest of the girls stepped forward, her silver markings faintly shimmering. "Without you, we would not be here. For that, we are grateful." Jake shrugged. "I wasn't about to let those guys take you. Besides, you all handled most of the heavy lifting." Her gaze softened. "Even so, you stayed." The words hung in the air for a moment. Jake looked at them, one by one. They were more than just passengers now. Somewhere between dodging lasers and outrunning bounty hunters, they had become his crew. Maybe even his family. But deep down, Jake knew this couldn't last forever. The girls were royalty. Important. He was just a cargo pilot with a ship held together by luck and spare parts. "So, what happens now?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice light. The oldest girl glanced at the others. They exchanged quiet looks, communicating silently in a way Jake still didn't understand. Finally, she spoke. "We must return to our people. There are few left, but enough to rebuild." Jake nodded slowly. "Right. Makes sense." The smallest girl tugged at his sleeve. "You can come with us." Jake blinked. "Come with you." He let out a dry laugh. "I'm not exactly royal material, kid." The youngest girl frowned. "You saved us. That makes you important." Jake opened his mouth to argue but stopped when he saw their faces. They weren't asking out of duty or obligation. They wanted him there. He sighed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Look, I appreciate it. I really do. But I'm not sure I'd fit in wherever you're going. I'm just a pilot. I'm not special. The oldest girl knelt in front of him, her glowing eyes meeting his. Jake, you are more than you believe. You have given us more than protection. You gave us hope. Jake's chest tightened. He wasn't used to this, to being needed. Before he could respond, the radar beeped softly. A new signal. Jake stiffened, glancing at the screen. Great. More company. But as the image cleared, he realized it wasn't an enemy. A large silver ship hovered in the distance, sleek and elegant, unlike anything Jake had seen before. That's not a bounty hunter, Jake muttered. The oldest girl stood. It's one of ours. Jake turned to her. Yours? I thought you said your people were gone. She smiled softly. Not all of them. The ship hailed them, and the girl stepped forward, placing a hand on the control panel. The transmission opened, revealing an alien figure with similar glowing eyes and silver markings. The figure spoke in their language, and the girls responded, relief washing over their faces. Jake stood awkwardly to the side, feeling like an outsider. Finally, the transmission ended, and the oldest girl turned back to him. They will take us home. Jake nodded, forcing a smile. Good. You'll be safe now. The youngest girl frowned, stepping closer. You're not coming with us. Jake hesitated, scratching the back of his neck. I don't know. I've got my ship. Places to be. I'm not exactly cut out for the whole royal protector thing. The girl's eyes dimmed slightly, and Jake felt a pang of guilt. The oldest girl stepped forward, resting a hand gently on his arm. You will always have a place with us, Jake Monroe, wherever you go. Jake smiled faintly. I'll hold you to that. The docking procedure began, and the alien ship slowly aligned with the rust bucket. As the girls prepared to leave, Jake followed them to the airlock, hands in his pockets. Before stepping through, the youngest girl paused, turning to face him. Will we see you again? She asked softly. Jake knelt down, offering a small smile. Count on it, kid. The airlock hissed open, and one by one, the girls stepped through. Jake stood alone in the empty cabin, staring at the closed door. The hum of the ship felt louder now, echoing in the silence they left behind. For a long time, he didn't move. Then, with a sigh, Jake sat back in the pilot's seat, staring out at the endless stars. Guess I should get some repairs done, he muttered, in case they need rescuing again. As the rust bucket drifted quietly into the void, Jake couldn't help but feel that this wasn't the end, just the beginning of something much bigger.